Hello and welcome to yet another module on population studies. Today we are discussing gender, marginal sections and access to environmental resources. Women's equal access to and control over economic and financial resources is critical for the achievement of gender equality and empowerment of women, and for the equitable and sustainable economic growth and development. Gender equality in the distribution of economic and financial resources has positive multiplier effects for a range of key development goals, including poverty reduction and welfare of children. Both micro level efficiency results through increased household productivity and macro efficiency results through positive synergies between indicators of gender equality and economic growth have been recorded. Development rationales for enhancing women's access to economic and financial resources include women's role as safety net of last resort in economic downturns. Long-standing inequalities in the gender distribution of economic and financial resources have placed women at a disadvantage relative to men in their capacity or capability to participate in and contribute to and benefit from broader processes of development. Despite considerable progress on many aspects of women's economic empowerment through inter alia, increases in educational attainment and share of paid work, deeply entrenched inequality persists as a result of discriminatory norms and practices, and the pace of change has been slow and uneven across regions. Women continue to be absent from key decision making forums shaping the allocations of economic and financial resources and opportunities, which further perpetuates gender inequality. The current financial and economic crisis is already threatening the progress made towards the achievement of internationally agreed development goals, including the Millennium Development Goals. The manner in which countries respond to a recession can have disproportionate impacts on women and girls, possibly reversing gains made, particularly through cuts in public spending on health and education and through inequitably designed safety nets. There is also increased risk of reductions in allocations to gender equality and women's empowerment. The international community has made strong, comprehensive commitments to gender equality and women's rights in access to and control over economic and financial resources in United Nations intergovernmental contexts. Human rights treaties, mechanisms and instruments have also addressed the issues of women's access to and control over resources. Governments have the primary responsibility for implementing these commitments. Women in many parts of the world continue to face discrimination in access to land, housing, property and other productive resources, and have limited access to technologies and services that could alleviate their work burdens. Unequal access to resources limits women's capability to ensure agricultural productivity, security of livelihoods and food security, and is increasingly linked to poverty, migration, urbanization and increased risk of violence. Population growth, climate change and spread of markets and urbanization have created new opportunities and new challenges in the women's access to land, housing and other productive resources. Attention to resource challenges women face in agriculture is essential for addressing the food and energy crisis and climate change in both the short and long term. Gender inequality in access to land and property is substantial due to discriminatory inheritance practices, unequal access to land markets and gender biased land reforms. Some progress has been made in legislative reform, but the implementation is hindered by socio-cultural norms and women's lack of knowledge of their entitlements. socio-economic contexts determine the appropriateness of different types of rights to land and property, including individual rights and group rights. Continued efforts are needed to promote gender sensitive legislation, enforce existing legislation, make judicial systems more accessible and responsive to women, and provide legal aid to women seeking to claim their rights. Land reform processes can play an important role in addressing inequalities in access to land and property. Land markets have, however, not been an effective means of transferring land and property to women in the many parts of the world. Improved access to water and energy in developing countries can reduce women's workload, increase productivity, and provide more time for income generation, political participation, and leisure. Women face greater obstacle in accessing irrigation for crop production and livestock raising due to insecurity of land tenure and the exclusion or marginal involvement in user associations. The user groups established to promote greater community management of natural resources, including forests, exclude women through discriminatory rules and social norms. Effort to increase women participation must address inequalities in governance structures and membership requirements. Equitable access to infrastructure and services are critical for women's economic empowerment. Transport improvements can reduce women's time poverty in rural areas in many parts of the world, as well as increase access to markets, schools, and services, with resulting improvements in productivity, health, and well-being. Agricultural extension services in many countries have largely ignored women, in part due to the fact that most extension officers are men who target male farmers and focus information and inputs on their priorities and needs. The work burden of women in many parts of the world could be alleviated through access to improved technologies, including electricity, which could increase health and well-being and free time and energy for other economic activities. Barriers to women's access to improved technologies include lack of adaptation to local conditions, discriminatory norms and practices, limited dissemination, and high costs. The potential of information and communication technologies (ICT) for benefiting women through time savings and access to information, employment, and income generation has not been fully realized, and women's access remains limited in many parts of the world, particularly in rural areas. Housing is an essential asset for ensuring women's independence and economic security. Lack of housing undermines women's potential to secure health, education, and employment, and increases the risk of violence. An increasing proportion of those living in housing poverty and homelessness are women and children. Due to discriminatory laws, policies, and customs and traditions, the state can play an important role in facilitating equitable access to adequate housing through legislative change and policy development, as well as direct involvement in provision of low-cost housing. A major proportion of the world's working poor, they are rarely visible in official statistics. The returns to the livelihood activity of women and men depends on both their labor inputs and their human capital, as well as on the economic and financial resources they are able to mobilize. Long-standing inequalities in the gender distribution of resources have placed women at a disadvantage relative to men in their capability to participate in and benefit from broader process of development. This has often left them dependent on male provision to meet some all of their need of their household. Policies which improve women's access to and control over economic and financial resources have direct implications for both women's economic empowerment and broader processes of development. Locating these policies within a framework of rights ensure that women's access to and control over resources is part of their entitlements as citizens, rather than left to the discretion of male providers, largesse of the state, or the vagaries of the market. There is a powerful body of evidence that suggests that gender equality in the distribution of economic and financial resources not only contributes to women's well-being and empowerment, but also has positive multiplier effects for a range of key development goals, including poverty reduction and economic growth. Evidence has also accumulated on the critical importance of women's paid and unpaid labor and access to and control over resources in enabling families to recover from the economic crisis experienced in recent decades. The 6th World Survey has been prepared at a time when the food and the fuel crisis that developed in 2007 have been overtaken by a global financial crisis of such magnitude that there is likely to be a prolonged recession around the world. The consequences of the crisis have already been starkly evident within the countries of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. With the failure of leading banks and the bailout of others using vast sums of taxpayers' money, the collapse of the housing market and steadily rising job losses in many sectors of the economy. The repercussions of the present crisis for developing countries are playing out slowly through the various circuits of the global economy. Trade, migration, capital flows, direct investments and official aid. Early evidence points to falling export orders and remittances and calls for protectionism. The predictions for the future suggest major job losses, declining foreign direct investment and a cutback in aid flows as the economy of the donor countries shrink and government revenues are focused on domestic issues. The gender equality implications of the crisis must be addressed. The norms and rules defining social relationships among different groups in the society, which place some in the position of dominance over others and differentiate the choices available to them, including in relation to access to and control over resources, have been termed structures of constraint. Gender specific structures of constraint refer to the social norms, values and practices which define inequalities between women and men in societies, generally allocating different roles and responsibility and assigning a lower value to those aptitudes, capabilities and activities conventionally associated with women. Gender specific norms typically include the assignment of responsibility for reproductive work within the family to women and the primary wage earning responsibility to men. Such constraints also include restrictions on women's movement in the public domain that prevail in some parts of the world and stereotypes relating to women or men doing certain kinds of work or using certain type of technology. Men are as likely to face cultural barriers in taking up activities and occupations deemed feminine as women face in taking up those defined as masculine. These constraints are not uniform across the life cycle, but can vary by age, marital status and position within the family, as well as other factors. Gender specific constraints create inequalities in the distribution of valued resources and capabilities between women and men on the basis of ascribed differences. More pervasive form of inequality relate to property and inheritance rights, productive assets and access to education, skills and paid employment. They generally favor men, who who are perceived as primary producers and wage earners, over women who are regarded as secondary earners. While both women and men from low income households may be disadvantaged in the pursuit of livelihood by the lack of education, skills, assets and networks, gender often intensifies the effects of other social inequalities in access to resources and opportunities. It is important to highlight the institutional as well as the individual nature of these constraints. Constraints may be imposed by institutions in the public domain as a result of active discrimination, unconscious bias or lack of knowledge. Institutions are bearer of gender-specific constraints when their principal actors reflect and reinforce consciously or unconsciously discriminatory norms and values which impose restrictions on women's choice. There are many examples of institutionally imposed gender constraints. Employers, both women and men, may discriminate in favor of men who are seen as unencumbered by reproductive responsibility or use women's assumed status as secondary earners to justify paying them less. Discriminatory laws, policies and programs can reproduce gender inequalities through assumptions about men's primary wage earning roles and women's domestic roles which often bear no resemblance to reality. Access to water resources is essential for domestic and productive purposes. The collection of water is one of the most time and energy consuming of women's domestic tasks in rural areas and urban slums in many countries. It is estimated that women and children in Africa spend 40 billion hours every year collecting water. Their time burdens will increase if droughts, floods, erratic rainfall and deforestation undermine the supply and quality of water resources. Improved water supplies which ensure adequate quantities of water of sufficient quality within reasonable distances can ease women's workload in both their productive and domestic activities, giving them more time to spend on income generating activities, political participation and leisure. A comparison of the domestic water supply in two villages in India, for example, found that where the water supply was working well, women were able to spend more time in income earning activity and substantially increase their income from 750 to 5,500 rupees per person per year. Lessons learned from field level experiences highlight the importance of water improvements for women's productivity in rural areas. In Burkina Faso, Uganda and Zambia, the time saving resulting from locating water resources within 400 meters of household range from 124 hours to 664 hours per household per year. In rural Zimbabwe, where women's gardens are an important source of income and food security, the collector wells project provided water for domestic use including home gardens. Although the average cost of building the collector well and setting up gardens was significantly higher than that for a standard borehole with hand pump, the money earned from the gardens was often invested in small businesses or saving schemes. In Senegal, sales of water from community boreholes to household and herders raised revenue that was loaned to women's group engaged in enterprises such as selling fruit, vegetables and groundnuts. Both women and men farmers need water for irrigation and livestock. In general, women face greater obstacle than men since access to irrigation system is often contingent on land tenure. Irrigation project managers tend to either assume that women's water needs are subsumed under those of men or equate them with domestic purposes. Women are often excluded from user associations or participate only marginally. Men, in particular those from more affluent households, tend to have more external ties, including political connections to irrigation officials, and to be more active at water user association meetings, giving them greater influence over water management decisions. Forests provide support to nearly half of the 2.8 billion people who live on $2 or less a day. This is according to World Bank report 2002, and play a critical role in global food security. Throughout the developing world, women make a significant contribution to forest conservation, included in agroforestry and watershed management. Women have extensive knowledge of the forest resources that provide important sources of nutrition and income for families. Women are disproportionately affected by the depletion of forests. Deforestation deprives women in many parts of the world of a major source of firewood, the most important source of cooking fuel in much of the developing world, fodder for the animals, supplementary food items, non-timber forest products used for seasonal income, medicinal herbs, and many other subsistence items. In the context of the decentralization of natural resources management, there is a greater acceptance that communities can manage common lands, forest, and water. This has led to formation in a large number of developing countries of user groups which work collectively to manage these common pooled resources. Exclusionary rules of membership and social norms have sometimes led to domination of such user groups by men and more privileged sections of the community. Community forestry programs which involve forest user groups in regenerating degraded local forests have, for example, been initiated in a number of South Asian countries, especially India and Nepal. Under the Joint Forest Management Program of India, women are often not members because the rules allow only one person per household to join, inevitably the male household head. Similarly, women are involved to a limited extent in the decision-making bodies of these groups, despite their substantial stake in and knowledge of the forests. At the national level in Nepal, for example, only 24% of members of executive committees in community forestry groups are women. Case studies of individual forest user groups show even smaller percentages in many areas. Women are, however, increasingly recognized as key forest users, and their participation is being encouraged. Where attention has been paid to governance structures, the skills and the competencies of membership and capacity to represent the full range of users, user groups can act as vehicles for enhancing women's access to productive resources. It has been noted that a larger proportion of women in executive committees has been found to significantly improve forest conservation outcomes as well as women's access to firewood. In India, membership guidelines for general bodies have been changed in some states to include all adults, and in both India and Nepal, there is some movement towards more gender inclusive guidelines for executive committee formation. On the ground, however, these guidelines are often not followed. The Hill Leasehold Forest and Forage Development Program in Nepal targeted resource poor household and disadvantaged tribal groups, giving special attention to women and women headed households. The project has given 1800 households 40-year leases to degraded forest lands for restoring the forests. Restored forest provided rich sources of fodder, timber and fuel, as well as trees and plants for use and sale. Ownership of goats increased from an average of 2 to 5 per household, and revenue from goat sales also grew. Women participants identified time saving in collecting grass, fodder and fuel wood as one of the biggest benefits. The technical assistance and credit provided by the project allowed them to cultivate mulberries and vegetables for sale. Women also felt that men had become more accepting of their right to land, and around 20% of leases were now registered in women's name. Now we come to the conclusion. Women's equal access to and control over economic and financial resources is critical for the achievement of gender equality and empowerment of women and for equitable and sustainable economic growth and development. Gender equality is the distribution of economic and financial resources and has positive multiplier effects for a range of key development goals, including poverty reduction and the welfare of children. Both micro-level efficiency results through increased household productivity and macro efficiency results through positive synergies between indicators of gender equality and economic growth have been recorded. Improved access to water and energy in developing countries can reduce women's workloads, increase productivity and provide more time for income generation, political participation and leisure. Women face greater obstacles in accessing irrigation for crop production and livestock raising due to insecurity of land tenure and their exclusion or marginal involvement in user associations. The user groups established to promote greater community management of the natural resources, including forests, exclude women through discriminatory rules and social norms. Effort to increase women's participation must address inequalities in government structures and membership requirements. I hope this information was of some use to you all. Thank you so much for watching.